Chapter 11. Death in the Night. "How can you be sure it's me?" I asked. "Just because I accidentally found the sword doesn't mean that I am its bearer." Kiro looked at me with a wry smile on his face. "The sword that has been lost for hundreds of years, that you just happened to stumble upon in the middle of a stream, in the middle of a dense fog in a land we've never been before? Yeah, that kind of stuff happens all the time." "Taran," Born said, "there's no guarantee that you're the prophesied one. But based on all that I know, you're the closest thing that I've ever seen or ever heard of." "So you will tell me where the stones are hidden?" I asked. Born let out a long sigh. "I will do my best," he replied. "What do you mean? Don't you know where they are?" "Oh, I know where they are. It's just that some experiences are harder to relive than others. I knew that hiding them was going to be no easy challenge, but I never expected the difficulty to be so great. Things happened to me. It was like there was some force fighting against my efforts to hide the stones. Or maybe I just wasn't as strong as I liked to believe. Whatever the case, once they were hidden, it became very difficult for me to think about them again. As soon as I try, my body starts to react negatively. It's like a pot of water over a fire. At first, nothing appears to be happening, but before long, the water is bubbling and boiling. This is kind of what happens in my body. I don't know if it is my blood or what, but it doesn't take long after I start recounting what I did with the stones that my body is a shaking mess and I can no longer function. Maybe it's the magic of the stones to ensure their hiding place." "How will I be able to find them then?" I asked. "I'll just try to recount as much as I can," he said. "It may take a while, but we'll get through it. We have to." And that is what we did. Over the next several days, bit by painful bit, Born began to relay the locations of the 3 stones, and I wrote down the information as he revealed it. In this way, he could disclose small sections and then not have to think about them anymore. It was still a struggle, and often he would crawl into bed a shivering wreck, but slowly we got all the information we needed. All 3 stones lay outside of the valley, which was lower down in the clouds than the rest of Taris. This explained why the mist was so heavy around their house. At the creation of Taris, the giants quickly migrated away from the lower sections and moved to the upper areas of Taris, where the mist was thinner and even some days non-existent. The first stone was hidden at a place called Dex Peak. It was a spire of rock on the side of the Kodesh mountain range that encircled the valley. Like the other rock formations in that region, it rose high above the surrounding landscape and was guarded by the Kilakal, a type of large predator bird with dagger-sharp claws and a highly aggressive nature. The peak was part of their territory, and they would defend it to the death. The second stone was located in an old town called Shender Marsh. It was a small deserted village on the far side of the Kodesh Mountains. Born struggled terribly trying to give us the details of this place. He could barely get out more than a few words at a time before he started shaking. Sometimes he would even break down and weep. Whatever happened there marred him extensively. All we could get out of him was the general location of the village and the adamant warning to stay away from it at nightfall. While the first 2 locations seemed difficult enough, I was hardly prepared for the impossibility of the 3rd stone's location. Born called it Korth's heart. When Korth died, he was placed in a massive ivory casket and buried deep within the king's castle. Born had discovered the casket after much searching, and had placed the final stone in the chest cavity of the great giant skeleton. This was the very same castle that was now occupied by Jack. After placing the stone, Born had sealed the tune using a secret combination of letters that only the Guardians would know. When I asked him what it was, he said simply that if I couldn't figure it out, I wasn't the prophesied one. In all, it took Born 6 days to reveal all the details of the stone's locations, and by the end I had a rough map and a heavy heart. The task to recover the stones seemed impossible, and I was overwhelmed at the obstacles before me. "We will have to be extremely cautious when we leave the valley," he concluded. "There will be enemies who will try and stop us." "You're coming with me?" I asked. I had assumed that this was my burden to bear alone, and the thought of their companionship was more than I could have hoped for. "This will not be an easy task," Born answered. "Hiding them was one thing. Recovering them will be another." My foot had healed to the point where I could walk on it without feeling any pain, yet I was still quite reticent about beginning the quest. Knowing the locations of the stones did not mean knowing how to successfully retrieve them, and in this Born could not give me any helpful advice. What if I failed? It was this fear that kept me from proceeding. I chalked it up to needing to come up with plans to attack, but in the end it was pure dread of the unknown. It was just before midnight on the 6th day when I woke up from a short and troubled sleep. Bourne had gone to bed earlier than usual, as the shaking had overwhelmed him so much over the last day that he was extremely weak. Bog's heavy breathing and Kirill's light snoring were familiar sounds by now, and were not enough to keep me from my sleep. Something else was troubling me. I tried several times to fall back to sleep, but my thoughts were so jumbled and my mind was so busy that all attempts at slumber eluded me. Finally, I decided to go for a walk. Perhaps the night air would be enough to clear my head and make rest possible again. Quietly, I slipped out of bed, dressed, and put on my shoes. I had the map and notes that Bourne had dictated to me. For some reason, I also grabbed my sword, though I did not expect to meet any trouble in the night. I suppose I just wanted to look at it, hoping to find some courage in its steely weight. I moved silently out the door and stood on the porch for a few minutes. The mist was as heavy as always, and the glow from the candles in the windows barely penetrated it. I stepped off the porch and into the mist and walked to the far side of the clearing that stretched about 300 feet in front of the house. I had no intention of going very far, just enough to feel like I had gotten away by myself. I sat with my back against one of the great trees that rimmed the clearing. Resting my head back against its trunk, I studied the map and tried again to think of some kind of game plan to move forward in the recovery of the stones. The sword lay across my lap, and as I gently stroked its silver blade, it began to hum softly, like the sound of the ocean from far away. It was as if the sword itself was trying to comfort me, to embolden me and give me the confidence that I was lacking and so desperately desired. Slowly, I felt my resolve began to strengthen. I knew what I had to do, and though I had no real idea how I was to carry it out, I determined that I needed to just get started and trust that the answers I sought would appear when needed. Suddenly, I heard a sound to my right, and out of the mist stepped the hulking form of a giant. He was about 6 feet in front of me and wasn't aware of my presence. He was stooped over, and his eyes were fixed directly ahead of him in the direction of the house. Then, just as suddenly, another giant followed him, and still another appeared off to my left. They were armed with swords and clubs and were moving forwards with obvious stealth. I heard the first one give a command in a tight whisper, and immediately all three dropped to a crouch. Another whisper came from somewhere off in the mist. There were others. How many there were in total I couldn't tell, nor did I know where they came from or why they were here. In the week since I'd been with Bourne, Bog, and Kirill, there hadn't been another soul. Now all of a sudden there were several, and they seemed bent on a nefarious purpose. It was obvious that they knew where we were and were hoping to take us by surprise. After another sharp whisper, the giants again stood up and continued their approach to the house, disappearing into the mist. I knew I had to do something. I had to warn the others, but there was no way I was going to get ahead of the attackers without them seeing me. I looked around desperately for something, for a solution, and my eyes landed on the rock the size of an apple that lay near the base of the tree. I had one chance. I picked up the stone and hurled it as close as possible to where I thought the house was. There was a moment of silence as I waited to hear if my aim was true. I was rewarded by a loud bang as the stone slammed into one of the wooden shutters over the window. I heard Kirill yell out in surprise, and then everything turned into bedlam. Knowing the elements of surprise had somehow been taken away from them, the attacking giants bellowed out their challenge and charged towards the building. My warning throw had given my friends just enough time to ready themselves, and even then it might not have been enough for a normal giant, but both Bog and Kirill were alert and ready faster than I could have ever hoped. I heard the sound of the door being kicked in and the screams of several of the giants as Bog powered into them with his incredible bulk and heavy club. Kirill's knife whistled in the mist as he sliced the few that had gotten past Bog's defenses. Their first attack stalled. The attackers pulled back for a brief regroup. I heard one of them shout, "Leave none alive!" and they renewed their advance. Everything happened so quickly that I didn't have time to think. I ran to the house with my sword held high. I had never struck a single living thing in my life, but the danger to my friends drove any hesitancy from me as I crashed into the attackers from behind. I caught them completely unprepared. I swung madly at the first giant I saw, and the blade cut deeply through his back, dropping him instantly. Several other giants turned at their comrade's penetrating scream, and my sword caught another one before they could comprehend what was going on. Then the uncontrolled chaos enveloped me. I was fighting for my life. I caught glimpses of Bog and Kirill throughout the battle as we all fought with deep and desperate intensity. At one point I heard Kirill's cry of pain over the screams of the dying attackers. He must have been hurt, but it didn't hamper his efforts. We all knew that giving up was not an option. And then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. Panting heavily, the three of us came face to face with each other. All of us had blood on our clothes, and Kirill's elbow was a mess of blackish red from where he had been caught with a sword. "Where's Da?" Bog asked, even before he could fully catch his breath. We realized that none of us had seen him since the ordeal began. Immediately we rushed back into the house. 3 giants lay sprawled on the ground where they had died after the first attack, but our eyes quickly moved beyond them to a 4th giant. He was lying crosswise over Born's body as it lay in the bed where it had been when the battle started. In 2 huge steps, Bog was across the room and pulling the limp body off Born. A knife protruded from the giant's belly. Somehow, Born had gotten to his weapon and was able to defend himself. However, he hadn't been fast enough. There was an ugly gash on the side of his throat, and his head lolled to one side as Bog lifted him to his chest in a hopeless embrace. Kirill came over to them and knelt at Born's bed. He laid his head on the mattress and wept. Tears filled my eyes as well. We stayed like this for what seemed like an eternity. With every fiber in my body I wanted to turn back the minutes. How could this have happened? Somehow I knew in my heart that I was the cause of this. If it wasn't for me, Born would still be alive. That understanding and the sudden reality of the fight that just happened overwhelmed me, and I felt bile rise up in my throat. I made it to the door before I threw up. When the retching was over, I was left with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. On shaky legs, I re-entered the cottage. Nothing had changed except Kirill's cries, which had been reduced to soft sobs. Then, all of a sudden, Born coughed. We were completely startled as Bog laid him back down on his bed. But the hope that had sprung so suddenly quickly dissipated as we were able to better see the wound in Born's neck. He didn't have much time. It must have been his incredible will to see our success that gave him one last bit of life. His voice was garbled and soft as he spoke. "It was the Foetin," he gasped. "No longer safe here. Must leave. Must find the 3. He was silent for a few breaths. Then with great effort he spoke his final 8 words. "The one that was 2 must be 1. His last breath left him like a ship slowly sailing out to sea. Kirill rested his hand over Born's open eyes and gently closed them. Bog got up and walked to the door. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Finally Kirill broke the silence. "We need to bury Da, and then we need to get on our way." "What about the rest of these?" I indicated the giants lying around. "They burn," Kirill said flatly. After carefully carrying Born's body out of the house, we gently laid it down at the edge of the clearing. Then we proceeded with the grisly task of gathering the dead bodies of our attackers and putting them in the house. In total, we counted 17 guards. In total, we counted 17 giants. When they were all inside, Kirill lit some bedsheets on fire with the candles. Soon the entire house was up in flames, the ancient wood receiving the flames like a long-lost lover. It was by the light of that inferno that we dug a grave for Born and tenderly laid him in it. Surprisingly, it was the usually quiet Bog who had a few words to say over the grave. He spoke them softly and deeply in a solemn benediction as Kirill and I covered the grave with dirt. When the grave was fully covered, we simply lay down on the ground around it. Knowing that we had a huge journey ahead of us, and because of the exhaustion of the past couple of hours, it didn't take long for us to drift off in a fitful but much-needed sleep. All night I dreamt of battling attackers that kept pouring out of the mist. Sometimes I fought all alone, sometimes with Kirill and Bog beside me, and other times even Bog and Kirill turned against me, and I was fighting them. I awoke often during the night. Each time the flames from the house were less than they were before, and each time the heaviness in my heart was greater. I finally awoke after what must have been the 6th or 7th time to pale light pressing through the mist, and I knew that morning had come. Bog and Kirill were just stirring as well. Gathering what food supplies we had taken from the house before Kirill had set it to flame, we moved away into the mist. Without saying anything, we all felt the need to get out of sight of the remains of the life that they had known. We broke our fast in silence, each person doing his part to prepare and share our meal. When we were cleaning up, I spoke. "What did Born mean when he said the Foetin?" "I don't know," replied Kirill. "I've never heard that name before." "Me neither," agreed Bog. Whoever they are not our friends, and there may be more of them. We can't stay here." "You don't have to come," I said. "This has already cost Boren his life, and there's no guarantee that it won't cost you yours as well. I'm the prophesied one. It's my yoke to carry." "There is nothing left for us here," he said. Kirill confirmed Bog's statement with his sober look. I nodded at them gravely, and with deep gratitude reached out to grab their hands. We stood there for a moment in silent commitment, and then began our quest out of the valley and into the wide world of Taris in search of the 3 stones that would give us a fighting chance against Jack's evil plans.